Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going back in time, way back, to explore the history of cats in ancient China. And get this, it looks like the cats that were first living in these ancient Chinese settlements weren't the same fluffy house cats that we have today. We're working with a really interesting new scientific paper, and it uses all sorts of sources. We've got genetic analysis and ancient texts, and even art to work with.
Yeah, this paper is really changing what we thought we knew about the history of cats in China. The first cats that lived with people in these settlements, they were actually leopard cats.
Leopard cats.
Yeah, Prionailurus bengalensis is their scientific name. And they were living in these settlements for a really long time, like 3,500 years before we see evidence of the domestic cats that we know and love.
Wow, 3,500 years. That's a really long time. So they must have been, I guess I'm wondering, like, were they just kind of hanging around, or did they have a particular role in these early settlements?
Well, they weren't just passing through. It seems like they had a real long-term relationship with the people who lived there. The researchers looked at ancient remains from a site called Quanhukun, and these remains go back to 3,400 BCE, which is, a very long time ago. And the analysis, it showed that those remains, they were definitely from a leopard cat and not a domestic cat. And the most recent leopard cat remains that they found, those were from around 150 CE. So that's a huge span of time. We're talking millennia that they were living alongside humans.
Thousands of years. Wow, that's amazing. So it making me think about like what their lives must have been like.
Yeah.
Were they like, did they have some sort of special place in the culture in ancient China?
It seems like they did. They're actually mentioned in some of the literature from that time period. And there's even this one artifact that's really interesting. It's a culinary artifact from a Han Dynasty tomb.
Uh,
And it shows a spotted cat on it, and it looks way more like a leopard cat than it does a domestic cat.
wow. Okay, so if leopard cats were around for so long,
Yeah.
then when did domestic cats, the kind that we're more familiar with, when did those arrive in China?
Well, it was a lot later than you might think. Domestic cats, Felis catus, didn't show up until around 600 to 900 CE. So that puts it during the Tang Dynasty. And to give you some perspective, that's way after other animals, like cattle, sheep, goats, horses. All those animals were already domesticated in China by that time.
That is such a huge delay. Why do you think that domestic cats were so late to arrive in China? How did they even get there? Like, did they just kind of wander in from somewhere else?
Not exactly. It looks like they most likely arrived in China by traveling along the Silk Road. The researchers actually found a genetic link between the oldest domestic cat remains in China and another cat from Kazakhstan that was alive around the same time. The oldest remains in China, by the way, are from a cat we call FS12.
The Silk Road. That's such an incredible connection. It really makes you imagine those cats traveling with all those merchants and all those exotic goods from all those different places, making their way into China on this busy, bustling trade route.
It is. It really is. And it just reminds us of how interconnected the world was even way back then. And speaking of that cat, FS12, there was something pretty fascinating about this cat. The genetic data, it shows that it was likely white, or at least partially white.
A white cat. Is there any particular reason why that would be significant? Was that a popular color back then for cats?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. There was a survey done of a bunch of ancient Chinese paintings, and they looked at paintings from the Tang Dynasty all the way up to the 20th century. And what they found was that white cats actually showed up a lot in those paintings. So this might mean that white cats, or cats with white markings, were especially prized back then. Maybe people even selectively bred them to try to get those colors.
So not only did they, arrive fashionably late via the Silk Road, but they also were sporting a very stylish coat color, one that it sounds like really captured the imagination of the ancient Chinese artists.
Exactly. Even in those early days, it looks like people were already having an impact on how domestic cats were evolving.
It's incredible. So we've learned so much already about these early cats in China, both the wild and the domestic ones. I'm curious, though, did these two different groups of cats ever mix? Like, did they ever interbreed?
That's a great question, and the answer might just surprise you. We'll dive into that and more in the next part of our deep dive.
We've been talking about those two distinct groups of cats in ancient China. The leopard cats who were there for thousands of years, and then those domestic cats that came along so much later. Did those two groups ever, interbreed?
That's where it gets really interesting. The research, it actually didn't find any evidence that domestic cats and the native Chinese wild cats were interbreeding back then.
No evidence. So, they were living in the same places, but they basically just stayed separate. That's kind of wild.
It is. especially when you consider that in Europe, well, there is evidence that domestic cats and European wild cats did interbreed at some point.
So what was going on in China? Why didn't those cats mix?
Well, the researchers think it probably had to do with those ecological niches. Like each type of cat might have had its own territory and its own, specific role within the environment. So maybe that limited their opportunities for interbreeding. Like, for example, the Chinese mountain cat. Well, it lives mainly up on the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. And that's pretty far from where they think domestic cats were first introduced in China.
Ah, so geography probably played a part too. But you mentioned something earlier about some concerns about hybridization happening more recently. So does that mean that things have changed?
Yeah, unfortunately they have. In more recent times, domestic cats, their range has expanded and they've reached the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. And now, when they look at the genetics of modern domestic cats in that region, they're finding that those cats have something like 1 to 10% ancestry from Chinese mountain cats.
Oh, no. So after all those thousands of years of, staying genetically separate, they're now interbreeding. What does that mean for the Chinese mountain cat?
It's definitely a concern. Hybridization, it can sometimes lead to some, beneficial adaptations, but it can also pose a real threat to the genetic integrity of a species. And that's especially true for a species like the Chinese mountain cat that has a really limited range.
So all these domestic cat genes coming in, that could really hurt the Chinese mountain cat population.
That's the worry, yeah. It really shows just how complex things can be, and sometimes even our smallest actions can have big and often unintended consequences for wildlife. And it raises some really important questions about how we can do a better job of protecting the genetic diversity of these unique feline populations.
It's almost like a cautionary tale, For thousands of years, these cats, they evolved separately, each with their own, lineage. And now, just because of us, because of what humans are doing, all of that is changing.
Exactly. It really highlights the need for us to keep doing research and to put more effort into conservation so we can try to make sure these amazing animals have a future.
It's incredible. We've learned so much today about the history of cats in ancient China. We talked about those leopard cats living in those early settlements, and then all that time passed before those domestic cats arrived, and how they probably traveled along the Silk Road to get there. And for centuries, they basically didn't interbreed at all. But now things are changing. Is there anything else from the research that we should talk about before we finish up this deep dive? We've learned so much in this deep dive about the history of cats in ancient China. From those early leopard cat settlements to the domestic cats showing up so much later via the Silk Road. And now, how we humans are changing things for those cats today. It's incredible.
It really is. And before we wrap things up, I thought there was one more point from this paper that I think you'll find really interesting. Remember when we talked about FS12, that oldest domestic cat that was found in China?
Yeah.
The one that probably had that white or partially white coat.
Yeah. And how the paintings from ancient China, they seem to show a lot of white cats, too. It made me wonder if people back then really liked those white cats.
Well, that's kind of what the researchers are suggesting. It looks like even way back then, when those domestic cats were first arriving in China, people were already influencing how they were evolving. Maybe they were even selectively breeding them to try and get certain traits like that white coat color.
Wow. So we're not just talking about, when and how cats got to China, but, how humans have been shaping their whole journey the whole time.
Exactly. The story of cats in China, it's not just natural history, it's cultural history too. It's really a story about this long and complicated relationship that we humans have with animals. It shows how we've influenced each other, sometimes, on purpose, and sometimes totally by accident.
That's a really good point. So as we finish up this deep dive, what do you think is the biggest takeaway for us, as people who love cats today?
I think it reminds us that our relationship with cats, it's always been changing, full of surprises. And the more we learn about their past, the more we can really appreciate these amazing animals and appreciate how much we actually play a role in what their future looks like.
I agree. It makes you think about how even the small things we do can have a big impact on the natural world.
It really makes you wonder what other amazing stories about cats are out there just waiting for us to discover them.
That's a great question. Something for all of us to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody.